it's said that ThyssenKrupp, the German company, wants to buy the whole lot so that it can use the Dutch plant that Tata operate and close down Port Talbot. What would be your message to them this morning?
Well, my message is clear to any buyer. What we want is steelmaking continues in Port Talbot just as it done for the last 100 years. And
explain this buy British policy that's come out in the papers today. It seems to be a request to buy British, not an order, not a injunction. There's going to be no sanctions for people who choose to carry on buying Swedish or Chinese steel.
It's first of all, there's a change in procurement rules that began months ago, and again, when people say, as I've heard in the last few days, say, look, this government hasn't done anything about this until now. I mean, we've been doing so much. We talked about energy compensation, procurement policies. We became the first of the EU 28 countries to change our procurement policies to allow for economic and social factors to be taken into account. What it does as a result, it makes it far, far more likely that when it comes to British purchases, your British government purchases in infrastructure, for example, that British steel will be used. And that's already been happening, by the way. When you look at National Rail, 99% of its steel is British. Crossrail, the biggest infrastructure project in Europe, 26 miles of track across London, all British steel.
So that's the, if you like, that's the domestic side. But we both know the big picture is the huge quantity of underpriced, cut-priced, dumped Chinese steel.
That's a big problem.
Now, the Americans put up huge tariffs to protect their own steel industry. In Europe, we haven't done that, partly because the British government, you as it were, has been leading the charge against new tariffs on Chinese steel.
That couldn't be further from the truth. There is so much misinformation about this, and I'm glad you've given me this opportunity
I'm going to read you what Axel Eggert, who's head of the European Steel Association, says. The UK is the ringleader in a blocking minority of member states preventing a European Commission proposal on the modernisation of Europe's trade defence instruments.
Yeah, and let me, as I said, there's so much misinformation about this, and I'm happy to clear it up.
Is
that true? That is misleading. It is absolutely misleading, and let me explain why. First of all, the UK has been the leader in getting more done when there is evidence of dumping and imposing tariffs. And where those tariffs...
small specialist tariffs, but they're tiny compared to what the Americans do.
Let's actually first look at what's been the result of those tariffs, where they've actually been introduced. If you look at Chinese wire rod, tariffs were introduced, imports down to virtually nil in the UK. If you look at stainless steel flat products, tariffs introduced, the imports down 90%. And just a few months ago, the industry came to me about rebar, a particular product in particular, from the steel sector, and they wanted tariffs imposed. I led the charge with Europe for that. But they were introduced just months ago.
It's clearly nothing like enough.
But let's think about that. Compared to last year, this time last year, imports of rebar from China down 99%. So the tariffs...
So they work, and we need more of it.
The tariffs that have been introduced are working. What I do agree with is that the EU can work faster in its investigations.
And we must help the EU to raise tariffs against dumping.
Where there's evidence of dumping, absolutely, they should be using the tariffs.
Policy.
No, it doesn't, and that's where the misinformation is. The current policy, the sort of armour, the tools in the box that the EU has, are enough to introduce the tariffs, because what they say is you can have any tariff at any level as long as it removes the injury to UK industry, and that's what you want. Now, what that refers to...
Are we going to see higher tariffs against Chinese steel?
You will see tariffs being imposed more quickly, and you will see tariffs that are effective, just as the example I've given.
Gareth Stace, who's head of the UK steel industry body, says this is a deeper crisis than we've seen for a generation. We need to scrap the lesser duty rule. You know all about this. We need to see tariffs robust enough to stem that flow of Chinese steel, because he says we are drowning in Chinese steel.
And I think what Gareth and all others would agree with is the tariffs need to be high enough to prevent the dumping, to stop the injury, and we are 100% we agree with that, and we have pushed for more action than any other EU country in this. Just to sort of finish off, because you raised you had your earlier quote, what that's talking about, what other countries often talk about, are a wholesale rewriting of the tariff rules, and that's not really about steel. That's about, for those people, about having a more protectionist Europe, which is in no one's interest. It's not the interest of businesses, it's not the interest of consumers, but action on steel and focus on steel is correct.
You're a free trader, you're talking about free trade in Australia. You would accept that it is not free trade at the moment. The Chinese are subsidising their steel to the extent that they're destroying...
Absolutely, I accept that.
And therefore tariffs are completely acceptable.
Yes, where there is evidence of dumping, and with China there have been many examples, we absolutely should level the playing field with the right level of tariffs. There's no question about that.
Would it be easier to save the steel industry if we weren't inside the EU? Then we could have our own.
No, actually, if you listen to the industry itself, the UK Steel is the industry body. The head of their industry, I think you just mentioned him, Gareth Stace, just said a couple of days ago, because some people were suggesting that's the case. I don't know where that idea comes from, but he wanted to make it clear and said that he said that's just a distraction, and if Britain actually left the EU, the steel industry, and he believes more widely industry, would be worse off.
I was rereading your statement about why you were a Remain supporter, and I don't think I've ever read a more grudging, kind of self-lacerating assessment of why a politician's doing something. You said you don't like Europe, you don't like being part of it. If we were starting now, we should certainly not join it. But on balance, agonising, a bit like Jeremy Irons, I suppose, it's just about better to stay. Now, I put it to you that your side of the argument appears to be losing in the polls and so forth, and that even David Cameron's great election guru, Lynton Crosby, thinks there's a strong possibility of the Remain side losing this referendum. Are you, as a government, not heading towards a self-made catastrophe?
Well, first of all, I think Jeremy Irons is proof that there's a lot of people, I think probably a vast majority of the people in Britain, that have had to think about this carefully. And the result of the referendum, who knows what it's going to be. I'm just pleased that we're actually having the referendum. I think it's absolutely the right decision. I would like us to remain, and I've set out the arguments, especially the economic arguments for that. But it's going to be a decision for the British people. And as I've said all along...
There's no sense of creeping panic in the Remain
No,
camp.
not at all. I think, look, as the Prime Minister has said, this has never been an argument about, what makes Britain successful. It's about what makes Britain better off. I think Britain can be successful either way, and the PM said that many times. It's about what's in the best interest of our prosperity, what makes us most prosperous. And for me, the answer to that is clear.
Final question. We've heard from Sajid Javid, the politician. A lot of people have said in the papers that you are a steely, hardline, Thatcherite free marketeer coming from a financial background, and you don't really care very much about manufacturing, or steel in particular. What do you say to those people, if they're watching now?
I say it couldn't be further from the truth. And just judge me on what I've actually done in the few months that I've had this job, coming up to a year. In the first, so look at the fiscal statements we've had and how it represents the policy of my department. In the first budget in June of the new government, I introduced the apprenticeship levy. Many people call that one of the most interventionist policies that there's ever been in the space of skills. And I think that's a great example of how I want to turn skills around this country. When it came to the spending review, more money in collaboration for the auto industry, for the aerospace industry, and also, again, a big change in terms of how we cooperate and work with industry.
More Will Hutton and Ayn Rand. Thank you very much indeed, Sajid Javid.